library, and it is free for everyone to use these spaces if you reserve them online. So I would encourage you to do that. It's a beautiful place. My name is Kimberly Dudik. I'm a former state legislator. I am an attorney, mother. My oldest daughter is sitting back there at the table. I'm sure she's thrilled that I introduced her. And I'm happy to have all of you here. Today, we are fortunate to talk about our state legislature, our state constitution, and what we can do now that the legislature is over. Sine die, that means it's done for this year. But it's not really done because there's such a thing as interim committees that you will hear about. We will hear now from former state senator Diane Sands, and she's going to talk to us about the history of our legislature, as well as what we can do now to get involved in the interim committees and how they have changed since this last session. The rules have changed, so things are going to look different. As you may have seen in our schedule, we will also hear from the youngest Montana Constitutional Convention delegate, Maynann Ellingson. She will speak second. We're flipping our schedule some. And then we will hear from Senator Willis Curdy and Representative Bob Carter. They'll tell us about their experiences in the legislature and what they think we can expect this interim session, as well as anything else you would like to ask them about, I'm sure. And we'll hear from Missoula County Commissioner Josh Slotnick about how you can be involved locally if you want to help shape Missoula policy at a more local level. And last, I will speak with you about some of the lawsuits that have been filed to stop some of the unconstitutional laws that have been passed by this legislature. So that's what your day looks like. The next 3 hours, we have plenty of drinks and snacks over there. Please help yourself. If you need to get up at any time, the bathrooms are right outside to the right. And if you need to get up and get a drink or anything, please feel free to do that and move about at your pleasure. So I will start now by introducing Diane Sands. Diane Sands is a former state senator and representative for the people of Missoula County. She has been representing the people from Missoula since 1997 when she was first elected to the legislature, and finally she ended her last term in 2022 when she served as the House Minority Whip in the Senate. Diane represented Senate District 49, which is currently Willis Curdy's district. It's up the South Hill area, going a little bit west of town in Missoula. All the way to Idaho. So it's quite west of town. And she also served on numerous committees in that time, including the Senate Children, Families, Health and Human Services, Highways and Transportation, Agriculture, Judiciary, and Rules. And not only does she have significant political experience, but she's also a recognized historian of Montana law. Not Montana law, that's me. She is a recognized historian of Montana history. She is a joy to talk to and has worked on such projects as being the director of the Women's History Project, and she also helped spearhead a documentary on the internment camps at Fort Missoula that occurred during 1941 to 1944. Today, Diane will be speaking to us with all of her rich history about the Montana legislature and what we can expect in the interim sessions. With that, I will turn it over to Senator Diane Sands.
Kim and I have been doing this dog and pony show now for, 6 months?
6 months.
6 months. This is all her idea, not mine. So yeah, glad to talk to you a little bit about the history of the legislature and kind of the things that are changing structurally. But in this room, there's a wealth of resources. Raise your hand. How many of you are current or former legislators? Let's start over there. Senator Mary Moe. And we've, of course, got Senator Curtis and Representative Carter. How many of you have run for office? Oh, yeah. Ever faithful to Valley County, trying to get him to elect her. Not happening. And Dave. So some of you actually have quite a bit of experience in the legislature. So looking at this topic, actually this morning I was reading a history of legislatures, believe it or not. And one of the interesting things about legislatures is that they are not unique to America, but they are profoundly emblematic of our particular way of government. They're really based in the British common law, of course, and in the structure of Great Britain's Parliament. But I actually have a personal connection to the history of legislatures in this country because one of my ancestors was the person who brought the charter to Virginia in its colonial days to establish the first colonial legislature in the United States, which is really how the United States organized itself, was into that form of government. Some other countries didn't do it that way. Certainly the people on the West Coast or the part of the United States that was Mexican did not organize itself that way, but the British colonies organized themselves through the British model of legislatures. So going back to 1619 when Virginia first did its version, on the British model, a House, a Senate, divided with equal powers, and then an administrative governor of some kind, and a court. So those are the basic structures that you have in most modern democracies. Now, whether they're really a democracy or not becomes another matter, but that's the structure of them. I gave you a couple of things. One is the Constitution, and so if you would open your Constitution to page 22, the structure of the legislature. Might as well get right at it here. So this document is important for the structure of government overall. In fact, in the 1960s, when the League of Women Voters and other organizations were working on the restructuring of government in Montana at every level, we had government structures that just didn't function. We had hundreds of bureaus that were, many of them, totally autonomous and under nobody's control, et cetera. So the reorganization of state government in that era of sort of progressive change in the 60s and 70s resulted, one of the things it resulted in is this new Constitution. And the Constitution really reflects kind of the progressive thinking of that era. I'm not sure that it would pass these days, but it is up for review in 25. So take your little one home, read it, mark it up, because you're going to be needing it. So one of the first things the Constitution does is lay out, after you get past the articles of your rights, is the structure of government. So the legislature itself, again, the power of the people is vested in the legislature. The size, 50 in the House, in the Senate, and 100 in the House. The election, 2-year terms in the House, 4-year terms in the Senate. It's not in this section, but those terms are restricted. We have term limits, which goes back to a kind of a national movement at one point to try to see if we could have term limits for Congress at the federal level. That was ruled unconstitutional at the federal level, but some of the states that had term limits, Montana being one of them, still have them. Not very many states any longer have term limits. And you won't find any legislators that think it's a good idea. None. It takes a long time to learn how to be effective in the legislature. Memory is important. The turnover was more than adequate before term limits, but we still have it, and that means that people who have that institutional memory and the memory on various issues and how that system works get booted out of there. I mean, in my last days, I was still learning new tools and new ways to be effective in that system. So it really does take experience, just like it does in any other line of work. But term limits is one that we're stuck with. So at this point, it is, you can serve 8 years in the House and then 8 years in the Senate. And some people can flip back and forth, but basically that's it. Legislators are provided with minimal compensation for their work. Have we resolved this issue of? We have not resolved it. My last term, we were getting 11 something an hour. The kid next door works at McDonald's is making more than we were making. We went up to 13 this session, and there was a move to raise it to 25, wasn't it? And the governor vetoed it or something. So, but the lack of adequate pay is really significant, and it's also tied to the issue of whether you have just a 90-day session, which we have, or longer. We are one of the few states left in the country that still is 90 days every other year, and that is really reflective of how complex society's gotten and the responsibilities we give legislators across the country to make these important decisions. The legislature is, arguably, the least powerful branch of government. I don't know if you all would agree, but we're only there 90 days for the most part. There are interim committees, and we'll talk about those, but for the most part, we're there 90 days. The administration, with all of its bureaucracy, is there 24/7. The judiciary has its own authority. It's only the legislature that is not there. And so a lot of the discussion within the legislature is how do we strengthen that body to be more co-equal with the other branches and to do a better job of representing the public. So that's involved things like, and how do you attract, I don't want to say a better quality of a candidate, but people who can actually serve there, because for a lot of people to run and serve, 90 days, if you're in a private business, who's going to take that over while you're gone? A lot of people can't leave their jobs and move to Helena for 90 days. So there's a real question about the pay and the length of time and the resources that go into being a legislator that really put the legislature as a branch of government at a disadvantage. I think the other part of that that's a disadvantage is until very recently, we have not been really adequately staffed. I mean, as part of the reorganization of government, there was the intentional creation of what we call legislative services. So as a body, the legislature has professional staff that do three things. One is the whole financial audit division that manage all of that. Another one is the whole branch that deals with all of our legal issues, and the other deals with bills and all of the legislative process. And they do a fabulous job. And those are really a creation, again, of the modern era. Because in the old days, who really ran it were the corporations, because they had staff. They were up there, the lobbyists. I drafted a bill for you, here it is, we'll run it. And so the creation of a modern legislature with its own staff is a way to separate us in some ways from the total control of the corporate interests of the state, who are up there, trust me, and they do have bills and they want introduced, and they do lobby their issues, and their voices get heard. So there is a question of trying to balance that out and make our legislative staff are very nonpartisan. They are very professional. They have deep knowledge on issues because they become experts in certain areas, and they advise legislators on, you know, here's the history of this. We've looked at this bill 16 times. Here's what's happened. Here are the constitutional issues. Here are the fiscal issues. And without them, we could not function. The other thing that's different in terms of staffing, and this is starting to change again as well, is the issue of staff for the parties in the session. Until very recently, the legislature met and did whatever it was going to do. Sine died, and then there was nobody in the Capitol that really was the official staff for the elected officials, as partisan elected officials. That changed 2 sessions ago when we finally got the House, the Senate, minority, majority, each got to have a staff person year-round, well-paid at a lawyer level, year-round staff person. Not to campaign, that's prohibited, but to help organize your caucus and around certain issues. And I think they have been enormously helpful, at least to the Democrats, to be able to keep people as a group together, because otherwise there really is no structure to hold, say, elected Democrats together when the session's over. Am I correct? I mean, there's none. So you're just kind of out there. So that is a really important advance during this session. Did they do something this session? You just added some more staff, didn't you?
Yes, we did. I think each party gets two additional staff members, and each body.
Yeah, so the House minority, House majority, Senate majority, Senate minority. Now there'll be 3 on each side. Those are expensive positions, but they do important work, because these issues don't just end when you sine die. They go on during the interim, and the coordination of that effort in terms of developing policy, making sure people get training, people have information about what's going on relative to the administration or the courts, has to be done by somebody. And that function is largely falling to these new paid legislative staff that we are now getting. And they are very partisan. They are intended to be partisan, but they cannot work on elections. So they're partisan, but they are not, they're prohibited from doing electoral stuff. So those changes are pretty significant. So for 90 days, the session goes on, and then its sine dies unless a special session is called. And according to the Constitution, either the legislature can call itself into session by virtue of a poll, or the governor can. But in all the years, the legislature has never called itself into session. Only the governor has. Except for one minor little thing where we screwed up a punctuation mark. And that was it. But in general, you don't have special sessions, even though the work could call for one, but unless they are very limited to a certain specific issue, they can get out of control and just turn into a brouhaha on all kinds of topics, and they are very expensive. And remember, people have gone back to their real lives. So they're not amenable to just dropping everything at a drop of a hat and moving back to Helena in the middle of the summer when the Capitol doesn't have air conditioning, among other things. There's a reason for that. So the legislature as a structure is also unique in some way from other states in that this legislature is a committee strong model. In some states, the leadership has the power to take bills that are requested and literally drop them in a drawer and never even have a hearing on them. And this state in the Constitution says you can't do that. Every bill that is introduced, not every bill drafted, but every bill introduced, gets a hearing and has to be acted on. You have to vote on it. You can kill it, you can put it on the table, you can pass it, but you can't just ignore it. So there is a record for every bill that has been introduced. And there is Maynard. How's your car?
It's not pretty good.
Okay. Well, I'm just wrapping up about the legislature as an entity. So the committees are incredibly important. They are more powerful in some ways than the leadership because the committees are given the authority to hear every bill in their jurisdictional area and to act on it. And that's where the real strength of information and expertise lies. As the former vice chair of Judiciary, for example, it was my job to know every bill that was introduced or sent to the Judiciary Committee for a hearing, to make sure we organized who was going to testify on it, to work with other legislators on whether it was going to pass or be amended, and then when it finally, if it did pass and got to the floor, to make sure and orchestrate who was going to speak on it, because not everybody's supposed to stand up and just talk about every bill because they have an opinion. It is the responsibility of that committee to manage those bills as they go through that time. Otherwise, you would be there for days. It's the only way you can efficiently move through most of these bills is to have that work rest with a smaller body of the committee that has heard all the testimony, has had the debate, and then brings it to the larger body. So we are one of the states that has a strong committee structure versus some of the other structures that we have. In the interim, committees continue to do work. We create some new ones on occasion, like we created transportation, which was new the other year. There are a couple that run 24/7, year-round, including Legislative Council, which is made up of the leadership of the House, the Senate minority and majority, and they manage the staff and manage those overall things. They are not making laws, but they are the management of the legislature legally. Then the interim committees, which are appointed in the House, they are appointed by the Speaker. You can request whatever you want. You may or may not get it. In the Senate, a committee of committees, which is just all Republican leaders, in this case, make a decision who's going to be on a bill. This last session, and this was the effort of Fred Thomas for the last 3 sessions, and he finally got it done, which was to change the structure of the interim committees. Interim committees, I've always thought, are among the most powerful tools the legislature has and most important for citizen legislators, because it's in those interims where you're working with a smaller group of maybe 10 or 12 people. In the past, it was equal Republicans and Democrats from across the state, working in depth on a series of study topics or topics related to highway management or criminal justice system. And so that work is done intensely in those committees. You hear from all kinds of experts, our staff, you get to know them really well who have the expertise in that area. And then out of that process come committee bills if they are approved. Those bills carry enormous amount of weight normally with the legislature because they have been really vetted by a group of legislators and all the other interested stakeholders who really know that topic in depth, and they've spent 18 months working on that topic. Not, a couple of hours maybe, a half an hour maybe, during the legislature having a hearing, having a quick debate and voting on it. They have been working on that topic at a minimum for over that 18-month interim. So interim committees are really important for that work. It's where you really, as a legislator, develop the depth of knowledge about topics, relationships with members of the other party, because you're not there, you're there working on issues. It's where you get the depth of relationships with staff who are the experts in those areas, the administration people who work in that area. I am really close with the Department of Administration, or Department of Transportation guys. We're like that, because you work with them every day. And so that process is really important. This session, they did what several Republican leaders, Fred Thomas, have wanted to do for several sessions, is to make the interim committees not be 50-50 Republicans and Democrats, but to be weighted toward the majority party. So on many of these committees, there's going to be one House Democrat and one Senate Democrat, and maybe you got 2 from the House, maybe. So, and then you've got 6 or 8 Republicans. So you've got a different dynamic that's going to be coming out of those interim committees, and it'll be real interesting as you follow them. Pick the topics you're interested in, like you did during the legislature. They're all going to be running on MCAT. You can follow their agendas, you can get all the emails, you can testify via Zoom. So you should participate in those discussions as you go along. Because I think people think, well, I've done my lobbying during the session, I'm done. No, I think that's where all of us need to sort of up our game and put more energy into being involved, is those interim committee processes, because they make a difference. I don't know, anything else you want to hear me talk about? I think that's good enough. So, that's it.
Thank you, Diane.
Next, we're going to have a very quick interim speaker. We're going to have the Vice Chair of the Local Democratic Central Committee, Dr. Lauren Wilson, is going to talk with you for just a few minutes about a way you can be involved locally if you want to be involved with campaigns. This is a nonpartisan event, but though I reached out, I didn't hear back from many Republicans about participating, probably because I'm a Democratic past legislator. But we are having civil discourse today, so it's not just a partisan thing. We want to talk about how you can be involved, and this is one of those ways. So Lauren Wilson, please come on up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to learn on a Saturday. I'm so impressed. In the spirit of learning, I first want to explain what a county central committee is, because when I first heard that, central committee sounds like something you saw in your government books about communist governments, right? That was their organization. So it sounds vaguely sinister. But what it is it's the building block of the party. And the county central committee is for all of, in our case, Missoula County, consisting of people from each precinct in the county. And each House district, Senate district are broken up into smaller precincts. We elect 2 people from each precinct. It's actually on your primary ballot. If you vote like a Democratic primary ballot or a Republican primary ballot, you get to pick your precinct people there. But we can also nominate people in the interim between elections. And those people come together, we elect an executive board, and this is in statute, actually. This isn't something we made up. Montana Code provides for county central committees, and our main function is to actually fill vacancies. So if any vacancy comes up in the legislature, we nominate candidates that then are chosen from the county commissioners. We also have a lot of other things we do, though, and parts of it are very official because we are in statute, but parts of it are kind of like a club of people whose main goal is to find and elect good Democratic candidates in the legislature. And we're really proud of the caucus we had this year. Thank you to those of you in attendance who really saw it as one of their main focuses to protect and defend the Montana Constitution and all the freedoms and privacies that allows us. And thank you for your work this session. If anyone is interested in getting involved, our meetings are open to anybody. We love to have people show up, take on projects, or just show up and learn. We meet once a month, and if you go to our website, MissoulaDemocrats.org, our next meeting will be there. We have several events coming up. We have a webinar on Tuesday. We have an event with all of the legislators on June 4th, actually at the Union Club on Sunday night. So that'll be June 4th at 5 p.m. We have almost all, one is out of town, but almost all of our Missoula legislators will be there to review what actually happens during the session. So that'll be fascinating. You can ask questions. So if anyone wants to get involved, just go sign up on the website, or Kim has my contact information. And I unfortunately have to leave because, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for talking about that. Now we are going to hear from Maynan Ellingson, and you are lucky to be able to hear from her today and all of her experience. Maynan was the youngest constitutional delegate to the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. She was 24 at the time and one of 19 women out of 100 delegates. Following the convention, she attended law school at the University School of Law here in Missoula, University of Montana School of Law. She graduated with honors, and she's had a full legal career, working for 6 years at the Missoula City Attorney's Office and later working at Dorsey & Whitney with a specialized focus as bond counsel. She used her experience for drafting legislation also in Montana for state and local finance matters. So it's very specific and specialized, and we're honored to have her here today to talk to us about her experience. So everyone, Maynan Ellingson.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I was late, but I guess better late than never. I appreciate your coming on this Saturday, and I look around and I try to figure out, well, how many of you actually were around in 1972? I see a few of you. I see a few that weren't. So I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to do a little bit of history before I actually talk about the Constitution itself. Why do we need state constitutions? Well, the main reason, there are really two. Under the federal Constitution, all powers not given to the federal government in the federal Constitution are reserved to states. So that's a very big residuum of power that states have. The second reason you have to have a state constitution is you can't become a state without a constitution. So Montana became a territory in 1866. And Thomas Marr, that galloping guy in front of our Capitol, well, he's not galloping, the horse is, but he was our first territorial governor. And if you have not read The Immortal Irishman about Thomas Marr, I strongly encourage you to do it. It is a brilliant book, and you wonder how this guy in his 40s from Ireland via Tasmania and the East Coast ended up being the territorial governor of Montana. And we still don't know how he died, but it's a fabulous book. Well, he called, the territories did not want to be territories very long. They wanted to be states because as long as they were territories, the federal government had a fair amount of control over what went on in the territories. So almost from the beginning, there was a big push for statehood. He called for a constitutional convention in 1866. A small number of, he did that without authorization from Congress, however. Small number of delegates were represented. They completed a constitution. It was sent to St. Louis to be printed so that it could be then presented to Congress, but it got lost. So that effort at statehood failed. It wasn't until 1884 that another effort was made to hold a constitutional convention, and this time William Andrews Clark, who we all know about, the Copper King, he was elected chairman of this convention, and again, our attempt at statehood failed because at that time, in order to become a state, both the Senate and the House had to approve statehood. In Montana in 1884 was a Democratic state. The Senate, U.S. Senate, was Republican. The U.S. House was Democratic. And neither house would vote to send to have another Democratic state or another Republican state. So for a long period of time, no states were added to the United States because they didn't want to switch the balance of power. And it really wasn't until 1888 that both parties had conventions and agreed that they should begin to let in statehood. So with that authorization, Montana held another constitutional convention. William Andrews Clark was again elected president. 75 delegates were represented. And to be honest, it wasn't a very good constitution. But nevertheless, it was ratified by 24,000 to 2,000 votes. And Montana became the 41st state in 1889. 1889. I sometimes get my numbers confused. Well, why wasn't it a very good constitution? Well, the people who were elected, who were the copper barons, who were the mining interest, who were the mercantile interest, they weren't really interested in creating a government that worked. As a matter of fact, they wanted a constitution for statehood, but they really didn't care about a government. So they had a very weak governor, a very weak legislator, and I'm going to tack on a point that Diane made. They wrote in special provisions that minerals could not be taxed and certain other mining interests could not. Battery went out. Okay. Just too electric. Okay. Under that Constitution, legislators only met every other year for 60 days. It was a very closed down session. I mean, nothing was open to the public, or there was not, even up until the time of the Constitutional Convention. What happened a lot at the legislature in those days was the control of the copper company. And there was an article written in a magazine called Inside USA, and this was in 1947. And it said, Anaconda, a company aptly named, has a constrictor-like grip on much that goes on, and Montana is the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The same thing was true of our newspapers. Our newspapers were by and large owned by the Anaconda Copper Company. The daily newspapers were quite weak, and people really referred to us as being under the copper collar. The Economist in 1957 said Montana newspaper readers are worse informed about their own affairs than the inhabitants of almost every other state. Lee Enterprises bought the Anaconda Copper Company's papers in 1959, and it started hiring young, aggressive graduates from the University of Montana Journalism School. And so we saw, starting with the Great Falls Tribune, a new era in Montana in terms of the reporting of news and people becoming more and more involved in what was going on. Things were changing not only in Montana in terms of the weakening of control of the copper company, but things were changing in the United States as well. In 1964, there was a very important case that has had significance, not only for Montana, but for every state, really. And that was Reynolds versus Sims, where the Supreme Court said legislative representation in both chambers had to be based one-on-one. One person, one vote. There was the old joke that in Montana, legislators represented cows instead of people. So after that decision, Governor Babcock then really tried to resist. He said, that will never work in Montana. And it really it took a lawsuit by a woman named Phoebe Herbig of Butte to sue the state over enforcing one man, one vote. But just think about this. Yellowstone County in 1966 had a population of 79,000 people, and Petroleum County had 894 people, but they each had one senator. So I think that, just thinking about that gives you some idea of how overrepresented rural Montana probably was in the legislature. So all of that changed after 1964. Other things were going on in Montana and the world. In the late 60s in Montana, we know we were beginning the women's movement, student protest over Vietnam, civil rights, Earth Day. Montana's voting age had been lowered to 19. Labor unions were still very strong in Montana, and the League of Women Voters was a very strong presence in the state of Montana. And they lobbied the state legislature to create a commission to look at whether Montana should rewrite its constitution or whether its constitution really was adequate for serving Montana. Well, this bipartisan committee of 13 citizens came back with their report, and that the Constitution really needed to be totally rewritten. So the legislature in 1969 put on the ballot the question of whether to call for a constitutional convention. And the League of Women Voters and other groups, AAUW, got very involved in lobbying the voters and encouraging the voters to call for the convention. They called for the convention by a 65 to 35% majority. So the 1971 legislature, they established that elections would be held for the convention in November of 1971. They said there would be 100 delegates. They said there would be 60 days to get the Constitution written and finished. They set up a study commission, not as much a study commission, but a commission to provide materials and papers, research, and staffing to help the elected delegates as they would convene in January of 1972. So there was a very big election in the fall of 1971. There were, as I said, 100 delegates to be elected, and there were 400 and let me get this number correct for you. There were 453 persons who filed for office. And we ran as partisans. You could run as Democrat, Republican. There were independents, and there were no party, free party people. So in the election of 1971, I should add, in 1971, the legislative session was controlled by Republicans. And so the call for the Constitutional Convention was equally supported in Montana by both parties. What happened in 1970, the 1970 legislature, there was a big fight over whether Montana should have whether Montana should have a sales tax. And the Democratic Party was very much opposed to a sales tax. The Republican Party was very much in favor of it. They had to impose a 40% income tax surcharge to balance the budget in 1971. But they couldn't agree on a sales tax, so they decided to refer that to the voters in November at the same election that the con delegates would be elected. So the voters overwhelmingly rejected the sales tax, 70 to 30%, and it is believed that the strong turnout by Democrats probably resulted in the majority of delegates being elected, or a majority of Democrats being elected delegates, because even after the first session after the Constitutional Convention, the House was controlled by Republicans. So the count at the 1971 election was 58 Democrats, 36 Republicans, and 6 independents were elected to the Constitutional Convention. Now, let me tell you why that was really insignificant in so many ways. I ran as a Republican from Missoula. There were, we had 64 people who vied for those 8 seats. So there was a primary election, and 24 people from the primary election went to the general election. And Missoula elected 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 4 women, 4 men. The oldest delegate, which was Lucille Spear, and the youngest delegate, I mean, Missoula had probably the most balanced delegation of the whole convention. 2 things were really significant about the makeup of this convention, and as Kim mentioned, 19 women. Prior to that time, there'd never been more than 2 women in the legislature at any one time. And so to have 19 women was pretty remarkable. So how did that happen? It really happened because the old Constitution said that no one can serve more than one elected office at one time. And so the legislators, many of whom thought they would run or could run or should run, wanted to run, were ruled ineligible to run. And so that opened up a very large window for women to run. And it's not like women were not otherwise engaged in politics in Montana. Many of the women who were elected were mayors or on school boards or on city council. A lot of them were active in the League of Women Voters. So it's not like there were these 19 women that just appeared out of nowhere being uninformed. They were very informed. But the fact that the legislator, that were not all of these incumbents, was very critical to the opening up to women. It was also very critical, I think, to the lack of influence of lobbyists at the legislature. because as Diane or Willis or anyone can tell you, lobbyists maintain relationships with legislators, and it goes from one session to another session. Well, when these 100 people showed up, very few of them had any relationship with lobbyists at all. And lobbyists found it very hard to lobby this group of people. One, just the lack of familiarity, no quid pro quo, it was just a totally fresh thing. The second thing is that lobbyists were not allowed on the convention floor, and lobbyists were required for the first time to actually file reports of money that they spent. That didn't happen with respect to the legislature until 1980. So truthfully, lobbyists were very hamstrung, and they've complained and commented about it a fair amount. But obviously, I think it was very helpful. Going back to the political parties and why I say it was pretty inconsequential, neither party took a position on what should be in the Constitution. So there were really no Democratic issues or no Republican issues. And the delegates voted to seat themselves alphabetically. The only partisan caucus that was held was with respect to the election of a leader to be the president of the convention. And the Democrats had put up Leo Graybill, and the Republicans had put up John Toole of Missoula. They had put up Bill Brown of Miles City first. There was a roll call vote. I was number 78 in the alphabet because I was Robinson then. And everybody up until me had voted on their party's choice for the president. But I thought there was no question that Leo Graybill would do a much better job. And so I voted for him, and there were all these little murmurs in the convention, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. We would have never made it, but for Leo Graybill, steady and sometimes heavy hand, but he kept the convention going. Well, so here we are. We've elected 100 delegates, ranging from 24 to 78. The median age was 50. There were lawyers, school teachers, beekeepers, radio announcers. Almost every occupation was represented. And there were about 8 delegates who had been in the legislature before. So they were useful in terms of setting up rules and so on. Well, let's get kind of to the meat of the Constitution and how we went about our business. We took suggestions from citizens. Every meeting was open to the public. We were divided as delegates into committees, and everybody got their first choice of a committee. Every committee had a Republican or Democratic chair or co-chair. It was very egalitarian that way. It was very, very bipartisan. The entire leadership was bipartisan. The secretary was a woman, Jean Bowman, who ultimately moved to Missoula. She was a Republican from Billings. She was the secretary. Dorothy Eck from Bozeman was the Eastern Vice President. John Toole was the Western Vice President. We had committees that corresponded to every article in our Constitution. So, for example, there was a Bill of Rights, and our friend Fellow Delegate Bob Campbell was very active on that committee. I was on the legislative committee. There was executive, judicial, general suffrage, education, taxation, natural resources. That covered them all. We all got our first choice of being on whatever committee, and I was on the legislative committee, and Diane can thank me for all the great work we did at the. I so believed, as did this whole committee, that the legislative branch is the most important branch. It's the branch closest to the people. We gave it lots of power. Prior to 1972, they could not even meet in interim committees the way Diane described, because the court had held, the old Constitution said the legislature meets for 60 days. And the court had held that that language on the Constitution meant that their authority ended when the session ended. So there was no ability to have these interim sessions. And that made our legislature so very, very weak. Plus, it met only every other year, and it had no staff to speak of. So we provided for annual sessions. There were no term limits. So the legislature was given a lot of power and authority under this Constitution because it is the people's branch and the citizens' branch. All of the legislative power of the state was given to the legislature except for the ultimate power that belongs to the citizens through the right of initiative and referendum. And this is a very significant issue in our state because what happens is it gives the citizens an opportunity, if the legislature has failed or continues to fail, not to act on something that the citizens want for whatever reason, the citizens can propose their own initiative and present that to the voters. I believe it's a fundamental right of a democracy, and likewise the power of referendum. If the legislature proposes something that people think the majority doesn't approve of, they can also get a petition to have a referendum to either nullify that law or amend that law. So the enhancement of the legislative branch was a very significant contribution of this Constitution. Kim mentioned the significant Bill of Rights that we have in this Constitution, and I will just say that it is considered the most far-reaching of all state constitutions with respect to the rights that it gives its individual citizens. We incorporated every right that was in the 1889 Constitution and then added some other very significant ones, which includes the end to discrimination based on sex, origin, religion. You may remember the Equal Rights Amendment had not been approved by the U.S. hadn't even been approved by the U.S. Congress. It wasn't until March of '72 that Martha Griffin got the Equal Rights Amendment passed by Congress and then referred to the voters. As you well know, we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment under the federal Constitution, but we certainly have one under our state. And I should just add, kind of parenthetically, Montana was the first time the Equal Rights Amendment was presented to our state legislature. It was approved by the legislature, but then there were efforts in 6 legislative sessions thereafter to repeal it. and it's just got harder and harder and harder. But finally, they gave up, and finally we got rid of a lot of the legislators who wanted to repeal Montana's ratification of the Constitution. So we have a very strong equal dignities provision in our Constitution. We have the right to a clean and healthful environment, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. We had several rights that the legislature has clawed back on, which I just think this is an interesting piece of history. How many of you have ever heard of the concept of sovereign immunity, or translated, the king can do no wrong? Well, prior to our Constitution, the state of Montana or its subdivisions could not be sued. So if a citizen was run over by a Department of Transportation vehicle and injured, there was no remedy against the state. You know, if you were run over by a truck by Montana Power, you could certainly sue Montana Power. Most of us really thought, that is really that's really unfair. And so we abolished that concept of sovereign immunity, but the legislature has reinstated it with some limitations. We're going to talk just a moment about two other really big highlights of the convention. The right of privacy. There was no right of privacy in our 1889 Constitution. And as you know, there's no stated right of privacy in our federal Constitution. But we knew that the case law, the U.S. Supreme Court case law, going back to about 1924, had recognized under other articles of the Bill of Rights that there was an inherent or an implied right of privacy. We thought there was no reason to rely on anything implied, that we clearly wanted it stated that the individual has a right of privacy. And it's interesting that it clearly says it's an individual right of privacy, not a corporate right of privacy, but an individual right of privacy. Now, I'm seeing my time is winding down, and I want to talk. I could just talk forever, I'm sorry to say, but I'm not going to do that. I am going to try to tell you some of the things that I think should be interesting to you as a citizen of our state, and kind of my own philosophy about this Constitution. It was not, well, I should say, at the end of our 60 days, we actually finished our work in 57 days. Pardon? Can't hear me? At the end of our 57 days, all 100 delegates came up to the front of the convention hall and signed the document. And then the next charge was to go and get it ratified. We had been given a budget of $500,000 for our 60 days, and we had $45,000 left. And we were going to use that to publicize the Constitution. And immediately a lawsuit. You can't use that money. So the court said, right, it's public taxpayers' money. You can't use it to advocate. So one of the delegates, Betty Babcock, who was former First Lady, she took up the cudgels and decided to raise money for the ratification effort. The ratification effort took place from the time we adjourned March 23rd to June 6th. Not a lot of time. So the delegates mostly just went out, went from place to place, meeting, all kinds of meetings. I can't tell you, I never knew there were so many organizations, how many Granges there were. Who would even think in western Montana? Well, Willis would know. We've got Grange halls. But I don't know how many times I spoke, and it was wonderful that people were willing, like you today, to come and learn about the Constitution. One of the things we did with the money that Betty Babcock was able to raise is we printed this voter information pamphlet. Now, we didn't print it on paper that didn't turn yellow after 50 years, obviously, but this is what it is. And every single voter in the state got this proposed Constitution. And it goes through article by article, says what's in the old Constitution, what's in the new Constitution, page by page by page. Then there's, it tells who was at the Constitutional Convention, and then there was a sample ballot, which I will find in just a minute. So the election was called for June of 1972. This was proposed. Now, the Constitution itself was presented to the voters, as was 3 separate side issues. There were some controversial issues. There were a lot, actually, but there were some that the delegates were pretty afraid to touch. Well, we touched them, but we were afraid to make a definitive decision. One of them was the abolition of the death penalty. Was very, very strongly debated. The other was gambling. The churches were very much against gambling. The tavern owners and tourist industry was very much in favor of gambling. So voters could choose whether or not to abolish the death penalty, whether or not to have gambling. And then the third issue was whether to have a unicameral legislature, which would be just one body, not a House and a Senate. We were sitting as one body, and there's only one state, Nebraska, that has a unicameral legislature. But there were a number of us that thought it would be more efficient. There wouldn't be any buck passing between the 2 branches and so on. Well, so we had the election on June 6th, and I'm going to tell you in just a moment what the vote was. It wasn't overwhelming. It was not like the 1889 Constitution, I'll tell you that. It was passed by 2,416 votes. Well, then, immediately a lawsuit, it didn't pass. It didn't pass, even though we had that plurality. Well, why did they say it didn't pass? Well, the truth of the matter is people don't read very well. So this ballot, it says, okay, it has 4 sections. One is for or against the Constitution. And it says the 3 alternate provisions do not affect the present Constitution. If those are adopted, they will become effective only if the Constitution is adopted. The voters should vote on all 4 questions, regardless of whether he votes for or against the proposed Constitution. Well, here's what happened, and I know there's some Butte people here, but who have some connection in Butte. But so in Butte, I mean, it happened a few other places, but it was overwhelmingly in Butte. They voted for gambling, but they didn't vote for the Constitution. So we had, if you added up all those votes, then there was like 6,000 extra votes. So the court had to determine, well, was this approved? Was the Constitution approved? So they well, and this is a really important question about drafting, you know. It wasn't approved by a majority of those voting at the whole election, right? Because you had 6,000 people that were there who didn't vote. But it was approved by a majority of those voting on the question of the new Constitution. Well, so this was in the Montana Supreme Court, 3-2. There were still some justices who were still, I would say, beholden to the older way of governing. 3-2 voted in favor of, yes, it was passed. Then it was appealed to the federal district court, and then affirmed again, and then it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the United States, affirmed it and said, yes, the Constitution passed. So it was a long and winding road, I will say that. Now, here's what I think is pretty significant. And I'm hoping Willis is going to talk a little bit about how you were able to successfully beat back proposed amendments to this Constitution. We made it fairly easy to amend this Constitution because it really is a democratic document. We really believed in the power of the people to have their say about what they want their government to be. So every 20 years automatically appears on the ballot whether to hold another constitutional convention. There was a question submitted, it'll be submitted again in 2030, seven years from now. The first one in, 1990, the voters overwhelmingly said no. Then in 2010, when it was presented again by a vote of about 65% to 35%, the voters said no. But there will be an opportunity to have another convention in 2030. Now, we also made it easy for the legislature to amend the Constitution. I think it's just right. Over supermajority, 100 members of the 150-member legislature, and I don't know, Willis can probably talk more about this. There were 64 drafts for constitutional amendments. All of those didn't make it to the committees, but actually none of them made it to the floor. But that does not mean that this legislature didn't do a fair amount to damage the spirit and intent of this Constitution. And I think Josh might talk a minute or two about it, but this Constitution really tried to strengthen local governments. This legislature, the last 3 sessions, are doing everything they can to take power away and limit local government. They are trying to make it harder for citizens to do initiatives. They're even trying to charge. They've imposed a bill to put a tax or a charge for people submitting initiatives. So my final word is, I think this is a really good Constitution. I think they're just words, though, on a piece of paper if you don't elect people who seriously take an oath to uphold it, and if you don't have organizations who are willing to take people to court when there are violations of the Constitution or when the legislature oversteps its boundaries, as I think it does, it takes a very diligent citizenry to protect what's in our Constitution. So I'll stop there so others have time to talk.
like to take some questions. We have about 5 minutes for questions. If anyone has a burning question they would like to ask Maynanne, now is your chance. It could be any simmering, smoking, any kind of question. Mary Mo, yes.
Mary Mo, she's going to probably ask a question that she can answer herself because she knows so much about all this stuff.
I'm curious about what you said about that court case that determined that the legislature had no authority beyond the 60 days, and yet sitting legislators could not run to be delegates. Does that seem incongruous to you?
Well, I guess in some ways you could argue that, but they were still legislators. They were elected for a 2-year term. There was the ability to call a special session. So, they were still subject to constituent pressure and so on, but they really couldn't, as a body, they couldn't do anything, even though they were duly elected legislators.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Is there any place or anyone or any organization that's collecting all of the different lawsuits that are happening as a result of the last legislation?
Well, my notion is the Montana Free Press. Thank God for the Montana Free Press. They have done a yeoman's job in identifying every piece of legislation. And I also think the Human Rights Network has, and the MEIC, although a lot of these organizations tend to just do ones that affect their interests, but the Montana Free Press really did a great job all throughout the session of keeping track of that.
Did you have a primary opponent when you ran for the con, and what did you do to get elected?
Well, I actually had initially 64 opponents, although, there were 64 that were vying for these 8 seats. And out of that, there were like 24 Republican, and I ran as a Republican. And right, yeah. So Missoula had 8 representatives, 8 delegates. 64 people ran in the general election for those 8 positions. Through the primary, that got narrowed down to 24, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, and 8 independents. So that was a little more manageable election. What did I do? I raised some money. I went door to door, I bicycled all over town. I had a corny platform, to tell you the truth. Now when I look back at that, I think it says something like "no axe to grind" or something like that. But I was like wanting to convey that I wasn't beholden to anybody, anything other than the state of Montana and this Constitution. And I should say, I was encouraged to run. I was in graduate school, and my political science professor encouraged me to run. He thought I, would be good because I was studying the Constitution. I knew what should be in a Constitution. And I don't know. I had been recently widowed and hadn't lived in the state that long. I thought the odds of me getting elected were pretty slight. But there were so many forums where you had an opportunity to speak and answer questions, and it ended up I was endorsed by almost every group that was doing endorsements. I was endorsed by labor, the teachers, endorsed by the press, the Missoulian, And it was just really because I really studied hard and really had a good, firm idea of what should be in the Constitution. And I campaigned on some specific issues. One was the Equal Rights Amendment. 2 was the right to a clean and healthful environment. 3 was statewide funding of schools, because school funding was so unequitable at that time. And so those were really big issues for me. I also did something pretty shameless, worse than even no axe to grind. I had a little radio jingle, and there was this, so in the background, there was a Simon and Garfunkel song, Mrs. Robinson. Well, I actually had not seen the movie when I agreed to that. So, so I didn't do everything right, I can tell you that. But for some, and not to brag, but just to say how miraculous some things can be. Out of those 24 people for those 8 seats, I got the second highest number of votes. This 24-year-old student. So I think it ought to give people encouragement that, you did this, Kim, as a young woman too. Just go out and work hard and try to do it and come up with funny jingles, I guess. What?
I think really most outstanding young person who participated in this, and other people recognized what an incredible potential she had. And another delegate, they sent her to law school. They wanted her to go to law school and wanted to make sure she did.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Robinson. That's really funny. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your stories. I know it's really valuable for us to hear that. Now we are going to switch things over, but before we start our next panel, I'm going to have somebody from MEIC speak very briefly about another way that you can track what's going on in the interim and be involved. This is Katie Stack, and she will tell you who she is and what our organization is and how you can be involved with them if you're interested.
Hello all, my name is Katie Spence. I work for MEIC, the Montana Environmental Information Center, as their Communications and Engagement Director, and just wanted to tell you a little bit about my organization and what comes next after the legislature. So MEIC is heavily involved in tracking the legislature. We had 6 lobbyists up in the Capitol this session, so we were working on energy issues, fossil fuels, mining, land development as it pertains to sustainable communities and housing, and more. And so we were also really closely tracking constitutional issues and working with Maine Ann. Our mission as an organization is clean and healthful. It's your right, our mission. So we were tracking that very closely because we didn't want to have to go through a whole rebranding process. So big thanks to Maine Ann for her work throughout the session and beyond on that. We also work closely with the media. We work closely to make sure there's good information out there about what's going on really dense but important policy issues, both during the legislature and beyond. We work closely with interim committees and follow what's happening there. We try to make sure our membership and the general public who's following this work knows when there's an opportunity for comment, because it's so important that people know what's going on and are able to make informed comments. And so as we start dealing with the fallout or the happenings beyond this session, it's important that you have a chance to weigh in on how some of that is shaped in the next couple of years. And specifically, that work that we do deals with clean air, clean water, how mining companies are regulated, which will impact air and water, how our public utility, Northwestern Energy, is operating and kind of what they're doing, which is a lot, and then government accountability. And so I'm happy to answer any more specific questions. I'll be here, I'm sitting in the back, but how you can be involved with MEIC is, at the very basic level, sign up to get our email newsletter. That's how we share what's going on, if there's an upcoming comment period, join us at an event. For example, Northwestern Energy's Integrated Resource Plan is coming out, so we're gonna have a lot of events around that. And you can check out our website, our YouTube for all sorts of information on the stuff that's going on, especially stuff that was happening during the session. And I'm also here and can answer questions.
Thank you.
All right, next we will be able to hear from two of our local legislators. We will hear from Senator Willis Curdy and Representative Bob Carter. Senator Willis Curdy represents Senate District 49, previously represented by Diane Sands. He is the Vice Chair of Senate Business and Labor and the Economic Affairs Committee. He's a member of the Fish and Game Committee as well as the Natural Resources Committee. Prior to being in the legislature, he served the people of Montana as a teacher, enriching the lives of many who have lived in this valley. He's also an avid pilot. If anybody's interested in flight lessons, I believe he's still doing that. He was also a smoke jumper. I'm just giving everything about you at this point, Willis. He also did smoke jumping. So that's Willis Curdy. Next is Representative Bob Carter. Representative Carter is a first-term legislator for Missoula County. He represents House District 98, which I believe was the House district that Senator Curdy represented before he was in the Senate. He's a member of the House Business and Labor Committee, Transportation Committee, and the Agriculture Committee. His experience includes a degree in computer science with minors in math and media arts and an emphasis in accounting. So at this time, I'd like to invite those two legislators to come up, sit down. I'll ask a few questions of them, and then we will open it up for a lot of audience questions so you all can interact with the people who represent you. So come on up, you guys. Here's my phone. Go ahead and take a seat. Thank you, Willis. Thank you. I have a few too many phones here. Okay. Go ahead, sit. You sit. Go ahead and turn on your mic there. Is that the one with low battery?
It is on.
There you go. All right. Put this one on. Okay, so we will start first with, if we could just have both of them, we'll have them introduce themselves and tell us about what their experience was in the legislature. If you have to share this mic because one of them dies, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Kim. Appreciate it. So I just want to make one thing perfectly clear to start with. Number one, I am Diane Sands' successor. I am not her replacement. Nobody can replace Diane Sands. Anyway, as Kim pointed out, I served on the Business and Labor Committee. I was the minority vice chair on natural resources and fish and game. I can tell you this was my 5th session, and we have a max of 8 if you go around the 4 or the 8 in the House, 8 in the Senate years. I am, I think, the 2nd most tenured legislator from Missoula County at this time. That tells you something about the impact of term limits. I mean, we have lost, because of term limits, some really fantastic legislators. Diane, Dick Barrett, Ron Erickson. I could mention a number. Kim, she didn't term out, I don't think. You turned out.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, this is really impactful on the state. You know, when you walk into Helena as a freshman legislator, I mean, the old proverbial fire hose is pointed at you. I mean, it's incredible. And I can tell you that it took my second term to really get my feet under me. And as Kim pointed out, I taught at Hellgate and Big Sky High Schools for 30 years. I taught U.S. government, Montana history, American history, and I have a minor in economics. So I thought when I walked in the door that I had this down cold. That is the most arrogant thing that I could ever imagine about myself. I was swimming for weeks. And I mean, that's how things are, how different things are in Helena. But to get to Kim's point, first answer. So in my 5 sessions, this is by far the most difficult session. Okay? In my Senate caucus, we had 16 people. We called ourselves the Sweet 16. Sweet but powerful 16. And it was a challenge every day to stand up and say, no, you're wrong, or we have to do something different than what's being proposed. And that's what it takes to stand up with the spine and say no, or we're going to do it otherwise. Now, we weren't always successful, but it still requires you to do that. And I'm going to leave it there, Kim.
So I want to make. No, that one's not going to work. I want to make one thing really clear, that I am Senator Curdy's successor, not his replacement, following Senator Sands as well. And everything Senator Curdy just said, I will back up. As my first session, I have no barometer to be able to measure previous sessions, and it was drinking from a fire hose, going in there with my math computer science background. You know, again, I thought, I'm going to show you data that's going to convince you of every brilliant idea I have, and you're going to vote for it, and it's going to be that easy. Senator Sands told me when I was running for campaigning that she said, don't worry, you're not going to pass anything your first session, so just go and learn as much as you can and try, and that's what I did. I thought, you know what, I'm going to prove her wrong. Look at this. I'm going to pass something that's significant, and I never even got one of my 5 things out of committee. So that was my experience. I learned, I wish I could go back and start this one over again, because like Willis just said, I thought that, you know, the naive me, term limits are fantastic. Get all those old crotchety folks out of there and replace them with all the new. As a 12-year school board member, my last year of being on the school board here before this, right after this election, I was still learning things about my school that I did not know. Kim and Mayanne spoke about the press coverage during this session. Montana Free Press, everybody downstairs in the basement where we have our bullpen down there. Montana Public Radio, there was Missoula Current was down there. I think KEIC, the TV, the press that was there, the coverage was phenomenal. I read every day and I learned something every day that I'm sitting in the middle of this and I had no idea the things that they were reporting. And so the press did a phenomenal job on everything they did there. And with that, I'll leave it to questions. And we'll talk about questions. I was going to, Willis and I were talking this morning about some of the things we were going to mention, and I said, you know, I think I'm going to talk about some of the Constitution things. And now I feel intimidated to talk about constitutional issues after listening to the wonderful, I have 3 pages of notes from Mayanne's stuff. So thank you so much for all that. And this is the 3rd time I've heard from her, so I really appreciate it every time I hear from her. So thank you.
Thank you both. So before we go to questions, first set us up for those questions. What interim committees are you on? How did that appointment process go? And what are you expecting this time? Because as Senator Sands said, it is no longer 50-50. It is now not equally bipartisan. It is now partisan, and it has the same limits that our legislature does. So what can we expect, and where will you be?
I chose my areas of expertise for my interim committees as well as I did for my during the session standing committees as well, and I didn't get any of them. Same thing with the interim committees. I didn't get any of them. So we don't get to choose our committees, and I was assigned technology, which is my field of expertise, but my understanding is chances are they're not even going to meet. So I will follow other committees and try to pay attention to what they're doing and be a good student.
Thanks, Bob. So I serve on the Environmental Quality Council. I've served on the Environmental Quality Council on all my 5 terms. We have oversight on fish, wildlife, and parks. We have oversight on the Department of Environmental Quality, and we have oversight on the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, and a variety of other things. So we deal with a lot of hunting, fishing, clean air, clean water issues, and the like. I also serve on the Water Policy Interim Committee. On the Water Policy Interim Committee, we deal with the quantity and to some extent the quality of water in the state. As you, I think, are all aware, water is critically important to this state, as it is to every place, but we are a headwater state for 3 separate basins. The Hudson River, the Missouri, and the Columbia. And you know, it's a big deal. And for a little bit of perspective, I'm sure some of you have seen these boat check stations around Montana. Well, that was my bill in 2019 that funded that program. And I tell you what, I appreciate it. It was a Republican state senator who chaired our Environmental Quality Council who asked me to sponsor this legislation. That's, you know, and that's a matter, one thing of trust. That's really critical in this business, is people who say, yeah, I think you can do this, or would you do this because I believe you can do it. So anyway, so those are interim committees I'm on.
So trust, that you get to keep that one. So trust, we're talking about civil discourse here and trust, although some people may not trust the legislature a lot right now because it seemed as though some of the bills coming out were a direct attack on some of the citizens of Montana. What can we expect in the interim process, Senator Curdy, because you've been on these equal committees? How do you think things will go now? And will that environmental committee also be a partisan slant as far as its members?
Thank you, Kim. Frankly, and I want to emphasize that frankly, this is going to be nothing more than an extension of the legislature. That's it, pure and simple. This is bad policy. Because in my previous interims, we have a chance on a 50-50 to really sit down and talk things out. Now it's going to be, we're in the majority, and this is the way it's going to be. Now that's pretty strong language, but I'm doubtful that things will be the same. Very doubtful.
Question related to that, I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the traditions in interim committees was that the leadership would rotate between the House and the Senate, the Republicans and the Democrats. So it was one of the few places that a Democrat could actually chair an interim committee, like I was chairing transportation last time. Is that also not going to happen as a result?
Yep. That is correct. Leadership will always be the majority party. Now, last interim, I served as the vice chair of the Water Policy Interim Committee. So it allowed me, when the chair wasn't there, or whatever, to run the committee. And like Diane said, she was the chair of the Transportation Committee. The Rabbi, Ed Staffen from Bozeman, was the chair of, I think, the Children and Family Services. So that whole interaction is going to go away.
So with respect to trust and legislature and politicians, what you saw this session, what we all saw this session, was a big power grab that is going to be accentuated because of the redistricting that's happening right now. And that redistricting is going to seriously rebalance how Montana votes and what voters have say in. Because currently in Montana, there's about 57% of Montanans that vote Republican. Well, that's not reflected in our legislature, which is currently 68% Republican. And so you saw a lot of things come through that was an attempt to try to hold on to that power that they have. And at the beginning of redistricting, the rules that everybody agreed to in their little sandbox that they were playing in was no side was going to be unduly represented by the results of this redistricting. And you saw a lot of disrespect, I think, for voters. The last election, we had LR 131 on the ballot, and then that did not pass by a pretty substantial margin. And then since the Republicans had a majority in the legislature this year, they just brought the same bill that they could push through. And so that pushing through of bills, I think, shows a lack of respect and a lack of transparency when, hey, the voters just gave you this message and now you're completely ignoring that. And I got up on the floor several times to speak of things. When everybody sends us messages through the state website, all that data is right there on the website, and you can see how many messages come through to people. And so there's some bills that would have, you know, hundreds or thousands or several thousand messages for or against a bill, and yet people will still vote against what their constituents are telling them. For example, I think it was Senate Bill 202, don't quote me on that, that said, in this essence, you cannot discriminate against petroleum companies in the state. And that was so broadly worded that you could, in essence, put a refinery next to a school, and you could not have local control in order to stop that from happening. And we had hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the state that were against that. And I think there were 12 people that messaged us for that. And 2 of those 12 people actually selected the wrong box because they said, you know, I am against this. This is crazy stuff. And yet it was tallied as something that was no. But I got up on the floor and I started, you know, telling every legislature, here's somebody from your district that's saying that you should not vote for this, and they didn't like to hear that. And so they objected to that several times, and it was kind of an interesting hearing to watch. But that trust and disrespect, I think, is coming forward, and I think you'll see that in the way that people vote after redistricting as well.
All right, let's do a few questions from the audience. Who has a question for our legislators? Go ahead.
Deanne talked about nonpartisanship with the Constitution. You all are talking about strong partisanship. What happened?
That's an excellent question. for example, one of the attempts that the CONCON did to try to prevent the overwhelming partisanship was to seat everybody alphabetically. And I heard this when I was knocking on thousands of doors when I was running for this, was I had one gentleman say, the first thing you're going to do when you go into the legislature is you're going to have this dividing line. They're going to set all of one party on one side and the other party on the other side, and you sit there in two different tribes, and you just hurl bombs back and forth against each other. And that's not how, you know, we Montanans and our neighbors think of each other. And you should think of each other as neighbors, and don't put people in big groups like that. In the committees that we sit in, I sit next to someone who I now consider my friend, who is politically as far away from me as you can possibly be. And we talk about our kids and our families and growing up a few blocks from each other and stuff. And we, you know, compare our notes when we're talking about bills that are coming through. And so when you have that relationship, when you can sit next to somebody that is not everybody that's sitting that necessarily agrees with you, I think that goes a long ways. And people bring bills every year saying, hey, let's seat us alphabetically or by district number or something like that. And every year it's voted down. So we all want to see that. We talk about it, but it's empty talk because nobody ever acts on it. And I don't know why that is.
That's a great question. So I'll tell you, national politics has come to Montana. Okay? So, and Mary's sitting back there, or standing back there, and Diane. I think we were all together in the 2015 session, if I remember right. Right? So in the 2015 session, we passed Medicaid expansion for the first time. Okay? We passed the Disclose Act, getting after dark money in Montana politics. And the third big item that we passed was the water compact with the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. You know how we did that? We did it by working across the aisle, you know, from, you know, those in our caucus, because all of us were in the same caucus, even though in different houses. But we were able to work across the aisle with moderates on the other side, a substantial number of moderates on the other side. The far right didn't have a prayer. We had a working majority. Now, we didn't agree on everything, but those big issues that made the biggest impact on Montana, we could work together and get that done. So, to answer your questions, what's happened? Well, we had to reauthorize Medicaid expansion, 2019? I don't know if, Mary, you weren't around then. You weren't there. Okay. So what happened after that session? Okay, again, we had that working majority. The other side, the hard right on the other side, went out and primaried a good share of their moderate members. You know where politics are completed or finished in this state on the other side? It's in the primary. And they primaried out a good share of their moderate caucus, they call themselves the caucus solutions, individuals. And that's what's happened. We've lost those folks. Okay? Really, really great people. Sure, we didn't agree all the time, but on the issues that meant the most for this state, we could get it done. That isn't there anymore. It's not there. It's gone.
So I'd like to follow up on that, and I'll get your question in the back. What do you see moving forward, which gives us hope and is a way for us to come together and actually, can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me at all?
Battery went out. We have one mic that works. Now you can hear me. So I'm following up to hear what can we do moving forward? And you know, this is all very negative news for us, but how do we bring people together? And you know, you're as elected officials, what do you see and how can redistricting help with that? But how can we come together and move our state forward?
Okay, thanks, Kim. So as you probably have followed the redistricting process, basically, you had two Democrats, you had two Republicans, and they couldn't agree on a third party, and so the Supreme Court picked, per the Constitution, the third individual. And I think we were able to put together a compelling reason to the chair of why we should draw the lines the way we have drawn them. Okay? So that's one thing that's going to help, because, I'm not going to go out and forecast how things are going to change. But if you take a look at the makeup of these districts, we will see no more, I'm not going to bargain on this. We will see a different makeup, a better makeup. Okay? Now, the second thing that's got to happen is that people in the state have to remember what happened the last 90 days. Unfortunately, a lot of people have short memories. But people are going to have to remember what happened. And so when somebody comes to the door and says, I want your vote, people in the state are going to have to ask some really tough, hard decisions, or hard questions. Okay? Why are we treating people the way we're treating them? Okay? Why are we going after our air and water quality like we are? Okay? Not just two of them. I mean, we've got to get serious about who is representing us.
Redistricting, I'm going to go out on the limb and forecast and say redistricting is going to do a hopefully significant adjustment at trying to adjust things in the state for us. And I see, lots of seats coming back our way. What I think is really interesting is that I would say about 75% of the bills that come through the legislature has bipartisan support. They're things that we all agree does help the state of Montana. And so that last 15%, 25%, there's 15% of that is this truly bad bills. And those bad bills, I don't think are coming from Montanans. A lot of that is, again, the corporate outside influence. I looked at some of these horrible trans bills and bullying bills and book banning bills, and they are the exact same language as Florida or some other place like that. And so those are the things that I think that we're getting influenced, because on a national scale, they see Montana as a place that they can influence. And so we're seeing that influence from the outside. But what you don't hear about is the cooperation. And there is some good cooperation going on. And the Democratic caucus, we were very together on a lot of the things. We would get together with the very conservative, I think they called themselves the Freedom Caucus, and we were able to meet with them and got rid of some of the really poor fiscal bills. We got together with the Solutions Caucus and defeated all of the constitutional amendments that were proposed. I think there were, my count was 67 drafted constitutional amendments. 19 of them were submitted to the floor, and all 19 of them were defeated because we were able to get together with some very moderate Republicans. And the very conservative Republicans see that as a threat, and they, like you heard, they are trying to primary out a lot of those folks that don't agree with them. And I don't think that represents Montana very well.
All right, so a question all the way in the back. First.
This is just backtracking a little bit, but I was wondering, a lot of my friends testified at committee hearings on different issues, and they were cut off by the leadership, and I noticed that they did that to a lot of students too, college or high school. I mean, is there anything to be done at that particular point when they make excuses to cut off the speaker, and they say, oh, you must stick to the point? Well, they are.
So the chairs wield considerable power. Okay? They set, when they take a look and they see 90 people signed up to testify, they will say we have 4 hours to do this, and so they'll limit time. I find it egregious that people travel hundreds of miles to go to Helena, and they get 30 seconds, a minute to say their piece. I mean, it's a matter of time when you get really, really controversial pieces of legislation. Now, are some folks getting equal time to speak? I will agree that they aren't. Okay? But it's a matter of, again, being able to control the agenda. I will tell you that if we saw things in a better balance, that people would be treated better when it comes to testifying. Okay? So, and that may not totally answer your question, but it's a matter of who's running the show. Okay?
So number one best way to get your point across is to be there in person and testify in a committee to the folks that are spending a bunch of time on that bill. That's no question. You can send as many emails and messages and text messages as you want, and those for legislators are really easy to ignore, quite frankly. So when you're standing up in front of you, or when they're standing in front of a committee, it's hard to ignore. And because of the makeup of the session this year, a lot of people that were standing up in committees were against these bills. And because you have these people who are against the bills, and because the chair of that committee has the power to be able to decide, it's discretion. They get the discretion to be able to do what they want. And if they feel that you're off topic, they can cut you off. Whether or not you're going to wrap that back around to the topic, or if it's ancillary to the topic, that doesn't matter sometimes. But because there's so many bills that came across this session, and because a lot of people who show up are against these bills, you'll see that quite a bit. And then the second best way is through the video conferencing. That's marginally better than text message and emails. And then your next is messaging your senators and representatives. And those numbers count. When we have the horrible labor bills this session, when we had so many people in their union representatives come there and testify, teachers and construction workers and stuff, most of those really bad bills were defeated. Unfortunately, a couple of the education bills got through, and we can talk about those later. But yeah, showing up is important, and unfortunately, that's how the game is played. It's easy to shut off controversy when you don't want to hear it.
One more thing, 2 words. You've heard it before, elections matter.
All right, next, go ahead. And Katie in the back. For a second, Katie in the back.
Yeah, so it's something I've wondered about from a personal perspective is there any appetite in the building for a bill that would limit the number of bills each legislator can introduce? Because I know there are a couple of them up there that had a few hundred introduced, and that doesn't track.
So, and Diane, I think, and Mary can both testify to this. We've tried that several times to try to limit the number of bills. That's up to legislative council in many ways. I think leadership in both parties need to be more suggestive of the bills that come through. Now, one other reason why we had so many bills this time, and I'll give you an example. Bob and I sit, he sits in the House, I sit in the Senate on House and Senate Business and Labor. We had over, I would say, 80 bills dealing with alcohol. Okay? We had a whole bunch of bills dealing with marijuana. We have a whole bunch of bills dealing with insurance. But on top of that, and maybe inclusive, the governor's red tape reduction initiative really caused a lot of these bills to be introduced into the legislature. Okay? So when you add, and a lot of that red tape reduction was maybe involved in some of these alcohol bills. But you also had a lot of people, and I'm going to step on some maybe tricky ground here, but there was a lot of self-interest here too. People looking to pass legislation on their own behalf. And that is one thing that we need to get a handle on. And we're here to look out and to represent and make laws for people across this state, and not for any one economic interest or group of people. We had a whole bunch of landlord bills that also were very controversial. Unfortunately, one of them was just vetoed here a while back, a couple days ago. But anyway, I mean, you had a lot of these bills, and it's the legislative leadership is going to have to say, you know, we've got 90 days, we've got X amount of time for each bill to look at, and so if you can't get your bill in this session, wait until the next session.
That's not the part I meant the self-interest.
Oh, well,
The Missoulian on mobile home.
yeah, I read the article.
How does somebody sit and not, when they own a trailer park and sit there and vote on the bill, they should be recused.
Well, it's okay. You know, it's one thing they need to publicly state and come out and say that they have a potential conflict interest. Okay, it's pretty tough to tell people not to vote on a bill. You know, honesty. But people have to say, you know, and everybody has to know about their own self-interest. And some legislators are really good about saying, yes, I have this self-interest. I do this. This bill could impact me. Okay? But when it comes to landlord bills, ever since the 2019 session, we have totally rewritten landlord law in this state. We had really good landlord legislation, landlord law in place, starting way back in the 1970s. And a lot of that basically has been dramatically changed.
Willis and I were just having the same conversation this morning about ethics and conflict of interest in the legislature. And we've got a couple of ideas that we're going to try to flesh out and bring forward to the next session. And so I don't want to disclose that quite yet. But I don't have, as a freshman legislator, have the answer to the question specifically. But for those who don't know, I'll describe what the issue is and know that it's a big issue and everybody recognizes the issue. But essentially, all of the bills that can be submitted to be drafted, and it takes time to draft a bill. It takes time for that bill to make it through the process, to be submitted to a committee, then to go to the floor for a vote, and then turn around and do the same thing in the next chamber. And then if there's any changes, it has to do the whole process over again. So before about the first week of session, legislators can reserve as many bills as they possibly want, unlimited number of bills. They can say, I have a bill regarding general revised education laws or transportation laws or something like that. And so you're encouraged, the process currently encourages you to reserve as many, and some people have literally hundreds of bills reserved so that they can use them later on in the process, because then you're limited to 5 primary bills, and then you're limited again and again through the first month or so of session. And all those bills then need to be fleshed out and submitted before that transmittal date of the session. And so because you cannot bring something past the middle of the transmittal, the session date, you're encouraged to do as much as you want before that. And because we have a citizen legislature, because we're limited on the amount of time that we're allowed to spend there, and because we have limited resources, I mean, some of these bills are really, I mean, some of them are 30, 50-page bills, and they're really difficult for these guys to draft, and there's a limited number of resources for all this to happen. So there's a lot of issues involved there, and I don't know that there's a solution. I'm sure every session they've tried to come up with better ways to do it, but that's the way that we have to do it right now.
We had one legislator who submitted 65 bills.
How many requests did they have for drafting bills? How many actually were introduced, and of those, how many actually got passed? Because candidates can say, oh, I requested 100 bills on every damn topic, and you look in the end, were they effective? Did they actually get that bill passed? And often the answer is no, because they did not focus.
Yep.
Well, I was just looking at one, and this one introduced 273 bills. No, not introduced, unintroduced total, and introduced 75.
How many passed?
It doesn't have that on the laws, just at the top level.
Probably not.
It was,
Okay. Well, you first, and then Mary, you're next. Go ahead.
This may be an impossible question to answer, but now we're going into the interim session, and the committees are now partisan. Does the GOP have a strategy where they put the committees to work developing next session's queue of bills where they want to put their focus on the most change to the Constitution? In other words, I'm trying to figure out where to put my energy, and I'm thinking ahead to the next session of where they're going to attack the Constitution, and that's really the most critical thing that we want to pay attention to.
Okay, so in order to change the Constitution, you have to have 2/3 of the legislature vote to change. Okay, remember during this last session they had 102 Republicans, so we had to get four votes from the other side to kill any attempt to change the Constitution. I don't think they're going to be in a position where they can do that. Okay. And I don't think a lot of times you're going to see interim committees basically deal with trying to change the Constitution. I mean, there are going to be plenty of other issues out there that, I mean, about how can the state of Montana remove a child from a family who is dysfunctional? Okay, this is a big issue. There are a lot of issues out there that we didn't cover or we didn't solve during this session that need to be answered. So coming back to the whole constitutional question could be moot if, I mean, we get a significant change. You know, we add, let's say, 4 people in the Senate, or we add 8 in the House. That whole Constitution issue becomes moot. Okay? But it's those other issues that have to be addressed that are problems that either bills that failed, or we have something coming up on how we're going to deal with a certain issue. Let's give, for example, in the last interim, some of you have been reading about the selenium issue in the Kootenai River. okay? It's doing major damage to the fishery in the Kootenai River, that coal mine in British Columbia. We dealt with that, both our Environmental Quality Council and Water Policy Interim Committee during the last interim. We had legislation to try to overturn what the EPA did with the rules and regulations on the selenium levels. Well, that will come back up again, okay? And so there's going to be, these things are going to pop up every single session or interim. So I don't know if I answered your question, but.
More targeted towards the threats to the Constitution, and more specifically about their efforts to turn the judiciary partisan.
But again, so, you know, and it was mentioned, Maine Ann mentioned about giving the legislature more power, okay? This is where the legislature really tried to extend its power, is its influence over the judiciary, okay? If there's one thing I could say we should have put in the Constitution is have a judicial nominating committee or something reflective of that. But we've got plenty of other issues to deal with during the interim. I mean, again, the constitutional issue is based on numbers, and hopefully they don't have the numbers to even deal with it.
I would add, I think the biggest danger to our Constitution is the attempt by the legislature to weaken the Constitution. And I really applaud you all for making sure those were defeated, because this whole Constitution only works if people accept separation of powers and checks and balances and equality among the branches. And the legislature really has attempted to usurp a lot of power.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think that this was the one chance they had to make the big changes to the Constitution. I think you'll see lots of, not as many attempted changes, but I think that's just to appease a base, is to try to make changes. But I think the adjustment to the legislature in the next session will prohibit anything that does not have true bipartisan support. And so that's my hope, and that's what I expect.
All right, Mary, why don't you go? And I think we have let's see, 2 more questions after that, and then we'll probably have to move on to the next section, but go ahead, Mary Mo.
I have a statement that I'd like you to respond to. Diane didn't mention one of the constitutional rights that we have in Montana, which is the right of every citizen to participate in government. And the legislature, in my view, gets that backwards. We have this much time, so this is how much you get to participate, instead of we have these many people that want to talk about this, so this is how much time we need. Respond.
Mary, you're spot on. Okay? But the matter is, you know, being able to make changes so that the public has the ability to participate. And that's where I come back to the elections matter.
Well, I'm hoping that as they're considering, because I think it was plain in this last session that they just had too many bills, but when I hear them talking about what to do about that, it's always, we didn't have time to think about it and stuff. But it was the rare hearing where public comment was not curtailed, and sometimes curtailed so that really I drove over here from Miles City so I could say something for 30 seconds. And that.
Yep. We need to respect our citizens better than what we're doing.
I would love to have the room filled every single hearing for every single bill. We know that's not going to happen unless you're super passionate about it. My main committee 5 days a week was Business and Labor, and I'll applaud the chair of Business and Labor. I think he was very fair. I think that there were only 2 or 3 times during the whole time where he said, okay, we have 3 or 4 hours for this bill. Let's keep this succinct, and please don't repeat the testimony you've heard before you. And people were respective of that. And there's only, I can only think of one time where people didn't get the ability to get up and say everything they wanted to say without being shut down at the end saying, my name is, I'm from here, and I support this or I oppose this. And so it's about the chair of that committee and being able to reserve the time needed for the big bills and then moving through the smaller bills that don't have any type of input. But having that public input is super critical. And it's all about the committee chair. There's some of them that just, they wouldn't even let legislators speak a second time on something that came up. And I don't think that's just or fair to anybody.
All right, one last question. Okay, go ahead.
I moved to this state almost 2 years ago to be with my family. I was an elected official in my former state of Iowa on the school board. And I agree with the comments that have been made about institutional memory. And how do we change people's ideas? So many people believe term limits is the answer, when those of us who have served in elected office understand that institutional memory is critical to a functioning government.
That's a good question. Montanans have become habituated to the notion of term limits. And, you know, when term limits were instituted back in Maynard and Diane, I think what was it, the 90s? The late 90s where we instituted term limits. Somewhere in there. So, I mean, it's become such that, I mean, Montanans just, I guess, haven't come to remember what it was like prior to term limits.
Well, it's been submitted to the voters twice to do away with it, and unfortunately both times the voters said.
Well, and that's a part of the, you know, this is the only thing we've come to know, and it's hard to understand or how to accept a change.
So I agree it's important. I was in the uneducated realm before I became elected to the school board, and then suddenly realization occurs, knocking on doors, trying to educate the public when they'd say, oh, you know, term limits are the answer, and I would have to disagree with them and say term limits are not the answer, and this is why. I think the optics of it is really poor, because here you have a legislature, legislators in a legislature that are saying, hey, we want to eliminate term limits, and it works really well in a citizen-led legislature, but our former mayor here said it many times, we have term limits every single election, and that can be decided. Here, when people are not doing this for the money, they're not doing this for, generally, most people, I would say, on both sides of the aisle, do this because they truly feel they're doing the best for the citizens of Montana. And it's really difficult to educate people to say, hey, this is in your best interest, and convince them of that. And I don't know that there's an answer to how we're going to be able to convince people of that, because we haven't been able to do it so far.
All right, so please join me in thanking our two legislators for speaking to us today. Thank you. Thank you for your service and for being there. Next, we will hear about how to influence policy and be involved locally. We are lucky enough to be joined by Missoula County Commissioner Josh Slotnick today. He has a history of dedicated service to the environment, to Missoula. Thank you, Maynard. Thank you. And to local farming. In 1996, he co-founded the Garden City Harvest and the Peas Farm. He is now director of the Peas Farm and has been a lecturer in the UM Environmental Studies program. Since 2018, he has served the citizens of Missoula County as one of 3 county commissioners. So we are pleased to have County Commissioner Slotnick with us today.
There you go. Thanks a lot. Can I pull this out and kind of walk around a little bit? There we go. Well, thanks a lot for, Ron, do you need me to do this for recording? Okay. So Kim, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out. So I just caught the tail end of that with Willis and Bob and listening in on the legislature. And what I'm going to talk about is non-legislative because I'm not a legislator. Don't know about that stuff. But what I can speak to is local government. So I'm going to start with 3 truths on local government. And these are things I've come to discover. I did not know this before I started doing this work. And I've been in office for 5 years. And I didn't know it really because I hadn't thought about it too much. But it's become really, these 3 things are super right in my face right now. I'm very aware. So the first one, local government is us. It's us. If you go to Fort Missoula Regional Park on a Sunday and you're watching little kid soccer, there is somebody in your view shed who works for the county or the city. If you're in a long line at a grocery store, there's somebody around you who works for the city or the county. We have nearly 1,100 employees at the county. There's, I think, 700 and some at the city. So when people say they don't like government or they don't trust government, I hope they're thinking more about the federal government. Because local government, it's us. And the people who do these jobs out of an active service, and it's a kind of a trade, too. And it's just like any of the trades you all have. People are getting up every day to going to work and trying to do the best that they can. And they are in our midst. Local government is absolutely us. And anybody could take a hand at it. And I'm not talking about the elected officials. You could do that too. Or you can work for the city and the county. This isn't like going to Congress. In fact, Kim now works for county government and city government. It's combo city-county health department. The second truth on local government, it's kind of invisible. So I had this conversation with a guy last summer, and it was a Sunday morning, and we were sitting in front of Bernice's Bakery. Do you all know where Bernice's Bakery is? On 3rd Street. And he was being friendly enough, but he had an edge to him for sure. And the gist of what he was saying was, what the hell, man? I pay all this money in taxes, and you guys don't do anything. I don't get anything. We're standing right there in front of Bernice's Bakery, and he's drinking his coffee. And I said, it's a pretty good deal. You can drink this coffee from Bernice's, and you know you're not going to get sick because the kitchen was inspected by the health department. And the sidewalk we walked on, it's pretty slick. This is really nice. It was put in a long time ago by the city. And in that street right there, the street too, that belongs to the city. And look, people are stopping at the stop sign because they believe in a rule of law. And underneath that street, there's sewer and water and broadband, all of which were installed or regulated or monitored by local government. And if I wanted to keep going, I could keep going. There's planes in the air. And I'm saying this is invisible because we have become so used to having a well-run, predictable, clean, stable, moderately prosperous society that I think for many of us, we just believe it's our birthright. I work hard and I'm born in Montana. Of course everything's going to work. Well, everything only works because we commit and recommit to paying for it and making it work. These are choices we make through local government over and over again. And if we didn't do it, the things wouldn't work. I don't know if anybody's ever been to a place that isn't quite so prosperous, that doesn't have public investment, but things don't work very well. It's not just because this is a great place and we're solid, strong, virtuous individuals. No, it's because we actually decided we wanted a clean, predictable, well-run place, and we decided to pay for it. And that actually works. The third truth on local government. So we got it's us, it's invisible, and the third one, it's foundational. Because we don't have to worry about public safety, because we don't have to worry about water or electricity or things basically generally working, you can spend your efforts on whatever entrepreneurial, cultural, trades-like pursuit a person wants without local government. And again, local government is us. It's not me and two other people. It's all of us. Without that steady commitment to providing those absolutely basic services, we would literally be chopping wood and carrying water. This guy just... I'll just talk about it. Sorry, Ronnie. I'm better at talking about it. So what I'm saying is it's foundational. Those basic services, we just expect to be there. And if they weren't there, we would be spending our time as individuals creating those basic services. Local government makes a foundation upon which we can build all kinds of other good stuff. So what I've also come to learn about local government is these three things I'm talking about. Typically when I talk about these things to an urban audience, people more or less go for it. They might say, well, it's not me, I'm not in local government. Or they might not believe that their money was well spent. But they kind of get the gist. We all collectively pool our resources and we get a stable, clean, predictable society. In rural areas, it doesn't fly at all. And Missoula County is a diverse place, and it's not a diverse place in terms of race, but it's really a diverse place in terms of economy and that rural-urban divide and how we choose to live. So I was recently in Condon, the north end of the Swan. You could not be in a more beautiful place. It was before this smoke came, it was just a few days ago. Snow and the swans, they're gleaming. It looks like they're coated in platinum. The sky is blue and the meadows are green. It's just, there's no more beautiful scenery on earth. And I was up there to speak to the Condon Community Council, and they were really mad. And part of me was like, how can we be here and be mad? But they were really mad because for them, local government wasn't us. They didn't know anybody other than the folks who were coming to talk to them, who worked for the county. For them, local government felt more like the federal government might feel us. It was distant, far away, out of touch. And that foundational piece, absolutely not. They were pretty solidly convinced that what they have, they made, and when the county shows up, they just charge money for things like building permits that ought not to be there. And it was a pretty hostile environment, actually. But it definitely opened my eyes. I've been to Condon before. I've been all over the county a lot. This just seemed especially pointed. And something I wanted to bring up because I'm speaking with an urban audience tonight. And when thinking about our local government, I think we need to be more conscious of this divide and attempt to integrate ourselves a little bit. Any thoughts on that? No? Okay, I'll just keep going. So Kim asked, how could people be more involved in local government? And that's a great thing to be more involved in local government. So on one hand, we have nearly 30 volunteer boards in the county. And these boards have specific roles where their job is to advise the county commissioners on some specific thing. We have a food board. We have a health board. We have a city-county planning board. We have boards that are specific to different parts of the county. The county's divided into community councils. So there's an elected body in the Swan, where I just was, Condon, thanks. We were speaking at a Condon North, what do they call themselves? Swan Valley Community Council meeting. There's a community council in Lolo. There's one in East Missoula, Bonner, Sealy Lake. It's not Frenchtown. What do they call themselves? West Valley. These are great. They're super great. Anyway, if you are interested in being on a board, you can go to the county website and see all these boards and you're supposed to run to be on the board, but typically people don't do that. There's not enough folks. We just appoint people. The other way that you could be involved is to go to some of our meetings. So we are in budget season right now. We're beginning budget season. Our budget will be done by August. And last year, we had 2 budget hearings, one to start and then 2 weeks later, another one to finish. And we collected public comment in between, and people were supposed to come and talk. Nobody came. $211 million budget. $211 million, of which a little less than a third comes from taxpayers. Nobody came. If somebody did come to talk, we would listen really carefully because there's nobody else, right? So if you have an interest in these things, come be part of the budget process. If you have an interest in being involved in county government, serve on a board. So what I'd like to do, if I can, is just kind of stop right there, and hopefully y'all can ask questions, anything related to county government. If nobody has any questions, I'll just start talking about property taxes. I really will.
Do you have to live in the county to be on county board, or can you live in the city and be?
The city is in the county.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, yeah. The city is the county seat. Yeah.
So
Sir?
Are the, like Condon Community Council,
Yeah.
are they?
They are, yep. They're elected by the folks in Condon, and their job is to make recommendations to us about what that area needs. And it's an important function because those folks live in Condon. They know what's going on. They're talking with their friends and neighbors, and we're not. I feel pretty up to date on what's happening right here, but I don't in Condon. So it was important to hear those issues. And one thing I got out of going to Condon and to Sealy Lake recently, and this is a big hurdle. I have the sense that a lot of people see local issues through a national lens, and it clouds judgment and makes it really difficult to have a dialogue. So if somebody's been listening to the news a lot and they've heard that, I don't want to be partisan, but they've heard one party is spending money like crazy and is completely out of touch and they're out to take your rights, and then I show up to talk about roads and bridges and culverts, they get pretty mad at me about the first thing. And I have nothing to do with that.
And they probably didn't hear that on a news program. They probably heard it on Fox Entertainment.
I might guess. And social media helps with this too. There's an information void that I think at one time was filled with more local journalism, and local journalism doesn't exist to the degree it used to. It's not very robust. And I heard this at City Club the other day. In areas that have a really robust local journalism or local newspaper, they're less partisan. In places that don't have good local journalism, they're more partisan because they're kind of pickled in the national media. This was really tough for us in Condon to get past. And when I said local government is us, I'm totally used to that in Missoula. And when I interact with people, I feel like I'm just like everybody else because I am like everybody else. But when I was in Condon, I didn't feel like that. I felt I was other and different, and everything I said was suspect just because I was saying it. And that's a tough position to be in. You can't really get past that. And I'm not saying that people listening were mean-spirited. It's just the kind of the soup we're in.
You know, I haven't lived in rural Missoula County, but I lived in rural Lake County. And you know, you first of all, you're out in the country, and the roads don't get plowed, and the roads have bumps in them and holes in them, and you're not really you can end up with a perception that you're not really using many government services at all.
You're totally correct.
And so when someone does show up, they do, you know, it's a problem or money
Yep.
or whatever. So, but on the other hand, you know, I was careful what I listened to too, and I think that's the other thing is in the rural community, you know, you can get dish or a cable channel or whatever, and so you can get out of touch with the local area, which I guess says then, okay, like you did, commissioners, et cetera, have to go to those areas if they want that support from them, and then start changing those perceptions.
Yeah, I'm going back next month, even though they were mean to me. For sure. So what we looked in, one of the things folks wanted to know about, and it's a really good thing to know about, where were their taxes going and what were they getting exactly for that money? And when we dug into it, we found that rural parts of our county were in a situation that's quite similar to how our state is towards the whole country. So I think I have this right, but Kim may know the answer if I have it wrong. For about every $1 we send to the feds, we get about $2.50 back. And this isn't because we're special, virtuous, hardworking, good-looking, anything like that. It's just because money flows from where it is to where it isn't. It's just how it goes. We don't have, as a state, a tax base big enough to maintain our federal highway system. We need money from the feds. It's huge. We're a huge state. It's a good deal for us. It's a bad deal if you live in Massachusetts. You pay more in than you get out. And it's actually not a bad thing or a good thing. This is just how it works. So in rural parts of the state, people pay plenty in property taxes, and the roads are bumpy and gravel, and they do rightly ask, what the hell am I getting for this? It's not like the guy standing out in front of Bernice's. And the tough truth of it is the taxes that people pay in deeply rural areas don't cover the full cost of managing the roads or providing public safety. Those costs are subsidized by people who live in the population center. And they didn't like hearing that at all. That was not a welcome message. Because they're mad as hell about this very library. And I get why. They live far away, they got to pay for it, and they never come here. It totally makes sense. It's just a tough pill to swallow. And so I want to say these things without, I don't mean to be demonizing anybody at all. I'm fully empathetic, but it made me aware, man, we have some real work to do bridging this divide. Please.
I think one of the smartest things Trump ever did was bring out the concept of fake news, because what that allows everybody to do is anything they disagree with is fake news.
Yeah.
And anything that they agree with is real news. You know, so then you listen to Fox Entertainment, and it supports everything that you want to believe.
Yeah, it's tough.
One more question. Two more questions.
Sure.
You mentioned your boards and commissions that people can go online
Yes.
and sign up. But,
Yep.
but do you make sure that you have a geographic distribution or rural urban?
Yes. Some of them, it's built into the bylaws of the board. So we have an election advisory committee, and on the election advisory committee, it's built into the bylaws. We need someone from West Valley. We need someone from Lolo. So it's built in there. Some boards it's not, because it doesn't make sense. Like we have the Florence Carlton Cemetery Board. There's nobody who's going to be on that. But the big county-wide ones, not all of them, but some of them have it baked into the bylaws. We have it on our city-county planning board that we do together, that a certain percentage have to be inside the city limits and certain percentage outside of the city limits. And COVID brought on virtual meetings, which has been a gift to these things, because then you don't have to drive so far. But you're pointing at something that makes good sense.
Just a comment, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean, at the state level, we see the same issue. I mean, the urban-rural divide is just, it's a chasm.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of rural folks, especially after a redistricting process, because as we see urban populations grow, instead of a representative or a senator representing two counties, they may now be representing portions of 4 counties.
Wow.
So they genuinely feel that they're losing influence. And I think, you know, that also happens at the county level. You know, Missoula County isn't all that big, you know, when it comes to counties in the state.
You mean in terms of area?
Area. But again, there's a real genuine feeling out there that people are losing control because they're losing, in their perception, representation and a meaningful voice in state and local government.
Wow, thank you for that, Willis. And that's really interesting because when I think about state government, and from the outside, not in it like you are, it seems to me that the locus of power is in deep rural Montana. It's not in Missoula or Bozeman or Helena or Great Falls or any of the population centers. It's in deep rural Montana. I mean, we're part of MACO, the Montana Association of Counties. Missoula County is. 6 counties are urban counties. We have our own little meeting. The other 50, man, they carry the way. Yes?
Well, what I've learned today is you may want to look at how effective they are in getting their policies and laws passed, because they may have a large voice representing rural Montana, a lot of noise, but actually it's how much they can deliver at the end. So all those rural, I get it, you know, Montana's rural, but the process ends up with a certain number of bills becoming law. That's what I'm interested now to look and see how much of rural Montana is getting actual laws changed.
God, these guys could speak to that, not me.
Well, everyone, let's
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. You're such a good speaker.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. You bet. All right, everyone. So we have heard from a lot of great speakers today. I've been taking some notes about things you're interested in. I'm going to talk to you about lawsuits. But before I do that, we had some questions about how to get involved now, where should you put your energy? And then we had Maynan speaking about the separation of power in our Supreme Court. And we have Supreme Court elections coming about. Most people don't really think about our Supreme Court, but they are the gatekeeper of protecting our constitutional rights. You talked about our Constitution. That will be up for review, but we have the justices on the Supreme Court who are elected statewide, who enforce the provisions of our Constitution. So if we had a change there, that those justices were no longer nonpartisan and were more politically motivated to make some other interpretation of our Constitution, that could be really detrimental to what was crafted in 1972. So if you're looking for where to get involved, start looking at the Supreme Court races. They are not as local as some of these races, but they have an impact locally. So you could see who's going to be up for re-election and find out how you can get involved there. They really are races that fly under the radar because they're nonpartisan. They don't have a political group behind them for the most part. But it is something that you should be aware of. So that was...
More specifically about how many positions open, how...
Yeah, so there are 7 justices on our Supreme Court. They're elected statewide. There have been attempts made, including this session and the prior session, and with some legislative referendums possibly, to have them elected by district, similar to how our legislators or district court judges are elected. They are elected for 8-year terms. They cycle so that there's somebody up on the ballot every 2 or 4 years. That I'm not certain of. Diane, do you know?
He's not going to run in for Chief Justice for one.
Is he running again? Okay, so, and then we have open seats, which it sounds like Chief Justice McGrath. Who's the other one? He's running again, though, isn't he, Standiford? Oh. Okay, so we may have 2 open seats on the Supreme Court. Educate yourself about who is running and get involved with their campaign, because that's where you can make a real difference by getting your local communities involved with those really important races. So we also had a question about Where can you find out what's going on? Who's tracking all the bills that are being challenged in court? We had the Montana Free Press during the session make an excellent website for following the bills. After the last session, they also had a website devoted to following which bills were being challenged.
That status. And no. Sapping the energy today. Okay. And what? Oh my Lord. Okay, we just put in new batteries. I give up. Okay, Sienna, see if you can do something. Okay, so yeah. All right. Here. This is my daughter Sienna, everyone. They had a website after the last session that detailed all of that with links to the lawsuit filings and everything. They may have something similar. I haven't seen enough yet, but it was very informative last time. So that is a good place to check. You can also follow Planned Parenthood. They have challenged many of the bills that were passed dealing with reproductive rights. The Center for Reproductive Rights also has a list of when lawsuits are filed. MEIC, the Human Rights Commission, and ACLU have all been involved with tracking those things. So you can always look that up online. But as far as what we have seen in this session, I will tell you what it looks like. To give you some frame of reference, last session there were multiple bills challenged, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Can you hear me? She's the future generation. I did. It didn't work. Now, is it working? Is it working? It doesn't matter. These are fun. Okay, it's not working yet. I give up. No. Thank you. All right. So the laws that were challenged last time, all of them were successfully challenged for the most part and not put into effect. This time we have lawsuits dealing with reproductive rights with some of these anti-trans bills that have been passed. And we also can expect some other lawsuits. And I'll go over what has been challenged, what we can expect to see challenged. So one of the ones dealing with reproductive rights. Coming back to our Constitution, which Maynard spoke about, we have a constitutional right to privacy. In 1999, our Supreme Court, those justices, held that that right to privacy encompasses your right to bodily autonomy, to decide what happens with your body, and that includes whether or not you carry a pregnancy to term, or if your partner carries a pregnancy to term, you actually get to make that decision, although it ultimately rests upon the person carrying the child. So that is something that was found in 1999, and it has been the rule in our state. It also meant that you could have your provider of choice perform any sort of abortion procedure. This means that it could not be just a physician, and that comes into play with some things we saw this session. So House Bill 721 has been challenged, and it is temporarily blocked. And this is a ban on dilation and evacuation procedures. Anyone know what those are?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, it's basically an abortion procedure. So that was challenged, and this law took effect immediately, and it challenged the law so that anyone who performed this procedure would be charged with a felony. So that law didn't go after the person having the procedure done, it attacked the providers. So I think the thought is if you can scare the providers enough, then there won't be anyone available to provide the procedures. It was a felony punishable by 5 to 10 years in prison and a fine up to $50,000. This was blocked. That procedure is the most commonly used abortion procedure up to 15 weeks gestation. And it also is used in the second trimester for many miscarriages. So this law would have blocked that. So that was blocked. Lewis and Clark County Judge Mike Menahan is on that case. Many of these cases have been filed in Helena because that is where the laws were passed. That is our state capital. It could have been filed in a different city possibly, but we have many of these in Lewis and Clark County. So our second anti-abortion bill was House Bill 544. And this would not allow an advanced practice registered nurse to perform abortion procedures. This goes back to that 1999 law that I said we had from State v. Armstrong, your provider of choice. That can include an advanced practice nurse. Prior to this law going into effect, there was an administrative rule put into place that basically did the same thing. The Supreme Court came out with a 7-0 ruling that sided with the advanced practice nurse practitioner who had filed the case and said that they were allowed to, that the advanced practice nurse was allowed to provide that kind of procedure. So because that rule was then ruled unconstitutional, the subsequent law is not going to be effective. That's why that mattered. And that also kind of keys you in on these things called administrative rules. They do not have to pass through the legislature. They are proposed by an agency and then approved by interim legislative committees that are now not bipartisan. They are now very skewed partisan. So you'll want to watch what's happening in these interim committees on the issues you care about, because administrative rules can be passed that positively or negatively impact what's going on. Another law that has been challenged and blocked is House Bill 862. And this would have required prior authorization before Medicaid would pay for any sort of abortion procedure. This was blocked, and it was found in 1995. There was already a court case that found that Montana Medicaid coverage would have to provide abortion coverage when they were medically necessary. So that was already the law in place. This would have changed that, but because we've already had a court ruling in place, this law has been challenged and blocked. So even though these things passed the legislature, they're unconstitutional. There has most likely been a legal review note from the Legislative Council, which is nonpartisan, telling the legislators what the legal status of the bill would be. And then most likely it said that this was unconstitutional. Nonetheless, the legislature passed it, and now we're spending our taxpayer dollars with those dollars, instead of helping people on Medicaid, defending bills that basically attack the lowest income Montanans. I'm not being partisan, I'm being factual. So that has been blocked. Another bill that was blocked is House Bill 575. This would have blocked all abortion procedures after 24 weeks and required an ultrasound before an abortion is performed. This has been blocked. These are all temporary blocks, except for the one dealing with the administrative rule, because we haven't seen the full litigation ensue, but they are not effective now. If you want to follow what's going on, you can just Google abortion laws challenged, and you will find a nice summary of our local news coverage, especially from Montana Free Press and some of the other sites who are following these. Two of the other issues dealing with the right to privacy and the right to utilize abortions are something we heard about earlier, House Bill 625. This was, y'all remember Legislative Referendum 131 that was soundly defeated, because this would have put a restriction on what could happen after an abortion procedure, or it was called the Born Alive Initiative, and that then a family could no longer decide what would happen, and that the doctors would be required to initiate all life-saving procedures regardless of what the family wanted if a child was born early and whether or not that child would be able to live. That failed as a legislative referendum, but the legislature seemed to not care, and they actually put this into a law and jammed it through, and with the makeup of our legislature, it is now a law. Last I saw, which was yesterday when I researched this, it was not yet blocked, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see something blocking that very soon. Another one is to revise laws to require reporting of individuals harmed by abortion pills. This deals with the medication abortion that people can do in very early times of pregnancy. It is not something for when you're far along. And a representative from Great Falls was able to get this bill passed. It has not yet been challenged, but it seems to be a real invasion of the right to privacy to have reporting of what happens to you medically to this state. So that will most likely be challenged under the right to privacy, if my crystal ball tells me that. And also, we have one more bill by that same representative from Great Falls that provides for licensure of abortion clinics. It provides much more stringent regulation of those clinics that do provide abortion services, and it's another way to put pressure on abortion providers that has not yet been challenged that I saw, but it most likely will be. So that's what we look like right now for reproductive health. The bills that have passed and been into effect have been challenged and blocked, but we aren't done yet. So moving on now to something else. We saw some very disturbing attacks on trans individuals, especially trans youth. And as Commissioner Slotnick said, we now have, I think it was him, no, sorry, it was Senator Curdy, that our national politics have infused our local politics. Actually, I think they both said it, because it's true. So we saw this as part of the national attacks against trans youth, and also against the sanctity of the family, deciding what to do with your own children. That Senate Bill 99 passed, and this has been challenged. It would have, this is a lawsuit challenging a law banning transgender youth from accessing age-appropriate, gender-affirming health care. So that has been challenged in a lawsuit brought by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Montana, Lambda Legal, and 2 families with transgender youth, as well as some medical providers. And this bill it bans the only evidence-based care for gender dysphoria for transgender people under 18. So now our state is telling us again what we can do with our health care. This has stated to violate the Montana Constitution, including the right to equal protection, which we heard about, and the right parents to direct the upbringing of their children, which is something that the state really shouldn't be involved in.
When did SB 99, when does it go into effect?
Well, it's been challenged.
To me, I know it's been challenged, is that if they did pass it,
what's the effective date?
What's the effective date, and is our children that are already on hormones and stuff grandfathered to be in, basically?
So I don't know the exact effective date, but it would defy logic to me that they would grandfather anybody in when what they're trying to do is exclude this sort of thing. So no one without that I saw would be grandfathered in. So I would say no. But if you want, we can talk afterwards and I can look at the effective date. I just don't have it in front of me right now, so I don't want to misdirect you. And then another thing that is in association with that is Senate Bill 458. This defines sex, not the action, but actually the sex of an individual in Montana law. It precludes legal recognition of transgender people and those with intersex conditions by defining sex based on reproductive organs. So that's great for those who want to define themselves that way. So this has been Senate Bill 458. I have not seen that it has been challenged yet, but I would be willing to bet that it will be challenged for all of the same reasons that the other Senate Bill 99 was challenged. So those are some of the things that we have seen and where we're at with some of those lawsuits. It is a very fluid environment right now. It's very soon after the session, and we have groups still working to ensure that these bills don't go into effect. Planned Parenthood has been very active with the reproductive rights, and the ACLU has been very active on some of the other anti-trans youth bills. So if you want to know more about those, that is most likely where you can find them. So I'm going to wrap up now just because we only have this room for so long, but I'll stick around if anybody wants to talk more about anything, and I think some of our other speakers might also. So I just want to say thank you all for coming today, and for all of those watching at a later date, thank you for tuning in. This has been an opportunity for the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies to try and educate and make people understand what their rights are, what our Constitution says, and then how our legislature interacts with that. We've been very fortunate to have current and past legislators here, as well as a constitutional delegate, and they all are really fountains of information that we're very fortunate to hear from, as well as our county commissioner. So if you want to follow more or see this again, you can watch MCAT. It will be streaming on MCAT channel 189 online. And this was possible with a grant from the Missoula Community Foundation. They have provided the funding for this. as well as with a media assistance grant from Missoula Community Access Television. So with that, I just want to say thank you all very much for coming. Our rights are important. Our state needs to stay the wonderful state it is. And thank you all for joining us tonight.